Hello, everyone. My name is Dustin Schwab, and I'm a career development specialist here at Opportunities for Ohioans with Disabilities, which we refer to as OOD. Today, I am co-hosting with my colleague, Julie Wood, and we'd like to welcome you to the Employer's Reasonable Accommodation Handbook 6-part webinar series for the 5th session titled Sensory Disabilities. Julie, will you please introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you, Dustin, and hello, everyone. We appreciate you joining us. My name is Julie Wood, and I am OOD's Worksite Accessibility Specialist. I'm also an occupational therapist and a certified ADA coordinator. In my role, I provide education for employers that's focused on creating inclusive and accessible workplaces. This includes discussing the guidelines under Title I of the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, identifying ideas to consider for reasonable accommodations, and sharing best practices and guidance for making the workplace accessible.
Before we begin, I'd like to mention that today's training comes with a learner's guide and a helpful fact sheet, which can be accessed now through the link that is posted in the Q&A section here in Microsoft Teams. Just as a reminder, the information we share in these resources and during today's conversation is for educational purposes only and is not legal advice. But we do hope this information is helpful for you. We will be stopping about halfway through today's presentation and then again before we conclude to answer questions. So please post your questions in the Q&A section at any time throughout the presentation so that they're ready for us when we stop. Julie, would you like to address the accessibility practices we have included in today's webinar?
Sure. We plan for accessibility from the start. For example, we use the accessibility checker that is built into Microsoft 365 to review the learner's guide, fact sheet, and PowerPoint. We address color contrast, font style and size, and add alternative text to visual images. Also, in our delivery, you will notice that Dustin and I mention each other by name as the conversation between us goes back and forth. We do this on purpose to indicate who is speaking. This can be helpful when attendees are receiving this information through services like American Sign Language interpretation and live captioning. After the webinar, we edit the transcript and fix any captioning errors before archiving the webinar in our on-demand library. Taking these steps up front can make this presentation more accessible and inclusive for everyone.
Julie, I'm looking forward to our discussion on making the workplace more accessible for candidates and employees with sensory disabilities. Do you want to review the topics that we will share today and the types of disabilities we are including in this conversation?
Sure, Dustin. We will provide an overview of sensory disabilities, which includes disabilities related to hearing and vision. We will share ways to create a disability-inclusive workplace culture by sharing some disability etiquette and awareness tips. And then we will talk about the interactive process, what is unique about providing reasonable accommodations related to sensory disabilities, and share examples. To support this information, we will mention a variety of conditions throughout the webinar for both categories. These may be repeated as examples to educate and inform employers of the best practices for fostering inclusive workplaces and providing reasonable accommodations.
Thank you, Julie. Throughout the Employer's Reasonable Accommodation Handbook, we've been sharing success stories of former OOD participants, and our first story today is about Marianne. Marianne has multiple disabilities that include hearing loss, chronic pain, and carpal tunnel syndrome. She has a master's degree in public administration and a Bachelor of Science degree from The Ohio State University. In the summer of 2021, she began looking for work that could provide accommodations that would aid in her success. In January of 2022, she was hired by the Ohio Department of Natural Resources as a program administrator for the Orphan Well program.
Dustin, Marianne oversees title services and public notices and assists with bid openings for projects. The Ohio Department of Natural Resources provided her with a mobile phone that connects to her hearing aids using Bluetooth. Marianne's supervisor said, Marianne has been a valuable addition to the Orphan Well program team. Her attention to detail and work ethic when completing title research and public notices have quickly become an asset to the program.
Julie, Marianne said, my future and my family's future are more secure now that I am receiving a regular paycheck and benefits. Marianne's disability is described as hearing loss. So how does that compare to deafness and hard of hearing?
Dustin, according to the Job Accommodation Network, known as JAN, it's estimated that more than 28 million Americans are deaf or hard of hearing. These conditions can result from factors like genetics, an infection, a health condition, physical trauma, age, and loud noises. As with any type of disability, there are different types of conditions and severity levels. Hearing loss can happen when any part of the ear or hearing system is not working in the usual way. Hard of hearing is defined as hearing loss that ranges from mild to severe, but the ability to use hearing to communicate remains to some degree. Deafness is defined as profound hearing loss, which means no hearing or hearing that is not enough to rely on to process information. It's important to know that many people in the deaf community believe that being deaf is a cultural identity rather than a disability. Because this webinar focuses on reasonable accommodations and the ADA, the term hearing disability will be used throughout.
Okay, Julie, we are also discussing vision disabilities today. What types are common?
Dustin, according to the American Foundation for the Blind, it is estimated that more than 32.2 million adult Americans report difficulties seeing despite using corrective lenses or are blind and unable to see at all. Vision disabilities can result from factors like genetics, congenital conditions, vitamin deficiencies, infections, age-related conditions, and head trauma. There are different kinds of conditions and severity levels with vision disabilities as well. Color vision deficiency is defined as the inability to distinguish between some colors and shades. Low vision is defined as a condition that cannot be corrected with lenses, but some usable vision is present. And blindness is defined as a lack of usable vision and the need to use alternative ways to engage in activities that people without vision loss would engage in by using their sight.
Thanks, Julie. Also, some individuals have both hearing and vision disabilities, which is known as deafblindness. When someone is deafblind, is this also a range?
Dustin, according to the National Center on Deafblindness, it is a rare condition to have the combined condition of deafness and blindness. The combination of these disabilities can occur due to a premature birth, a congenital condition, postnatal conditions, diabetes, and aging. Deafblind is defined as having combined hearing and vision loss that limits access to both auditory and visual information. Most people who are deafblind are not profoundly deaf and totally blind. Deafblindness is more likely to be a range of hearing and vision loss.
Thanks, Julie. We will discuss how sensory disabilities are impacted in the workplace a bit later in the webinar when we talk about the interactive process and reasonable accommodations. So now we have a story to share that is extra special to us because it's about our colleague, Allison. She is a program administrator in the Bureau of Services for the Visually Impaired at OOD. She works on the statewide team helping to plan and implement new programs and services for the Bureau and the individuals it serves. She consults with counselors across the state when they have case-related questions, leveraging her 10+ years of previous experience in vocational rehabilitation to serve as a resource and subject matter expert. She consults with other divisions and state agencies regarding the accessibility of websites and other electronic materials like forms and fact sheets. She also assists other staff who use screen readers with learning how to use them to perform specific job tasks.
Dustin, Allison shares that OOD's hiring and onboarding process was by far the smoothest and most stress-free experience she has ever had as an employee with a disability. Her welcome email included the name of the person who coordinates reasonable accommodations, and she was able to contact him and discuss her needs well in advance of her start date.
Julie, we're going to share more of Allison's story later in our discussion today, but I thought this was a good way to begin discussing disability inclusion in the workplace. Sensory disabilities can sometimes be apparent and sometimes be invisible. Therefore, some people with these disabilities have to disclose their disability for others to be aware. Why might someone avoid disclosing a disability at work?
Dustin, people with disabilities may feel reluctant to disclose an invisible disability, and even when the disability is apparent, they may feel hesitant to request an accommodation. This can be because of a fear that disclosing and asking for an accommodation will negatively impact whether they are hired for a job or selected for a promotion, or a fear that others won't believe they have a disability. Some individuals may be concerned the employer will think they can't afford the accommodation, or they fear previous achievements will be forgotten and they will be perceived as having a weakness. However, some individuals who have disclosed report this led to increased morale at work as others also shared their disabilities. And disclosing made them feel comfortable to bring their whole selves to work. So Dustin, for many reasons, it's beneficial for employers to foster disability inclusive cultures.
Okay, then let's review some practices employers can implement to provide a culture that is inclusive of people with disabilities. Are there any that are particularly important for people with vision, hearing, or combined vision and hearing disabilities?
Well, Dustin, one practice employers can follow is what Allison mentioned in her story, and that is having a process for providing reasonable accommodations, assigning someone to be in charge of this process, and remembering to include a reasonable accommodation statement in key areas and invitations, like what Allison received in the welcome email from OOD. Another idea is to offer a variety of types of education to all employees. Certainly, it's important to train new employees on the reasonable accommodation process, but also to train all employees and supervisors on a regular basis. Education can mean including topics related to disability in employee newsletters and providing disability etiquette and awareness education, which focuses on respectful interactions and proper language use. Some ideas specific to sensory disabilities include making sure the audio and visual content of online hiring websites and company intranets are accessible, which means including captions for sounds, alternative text descriptions for visual content, and ensuring the website is accessible by screen reading software. Another idea is remembering to create documents that use accessible color contrast, font size, and style, like we mentioned in our accessibility best practices for our webinars. It can be helpful to train all employees on how to make sure meetings and presentations are accessible, whether they are in person or virtual, because accessibility touches everything we all do. And one more idea is to install emergency alerts with auditory, visual, and tactile notifications so all individuals can be safely notified.
Julie, you mentioned a fear of negative reactions to disability might cause a person not to disclose. These negative reactions might come from generalizations or myths that people have about a certain type of disability. Let's review some common myths specific to hearing disabilities. How about I provide the myth and you offer the fact?
Dustin, that's a great idea.
Okay, so our first myth today is that people who are deaf can read lips.
Dustin, some individuals who are deaf can speech read. Speech reading can be difficult to learn. It includes interpreting body language, gestures, expressions, and context. It also relies on good vision and lighting.
Julie, what about the idea that people who are deaf prefer to communicate in written formats rather than in person, over the phone, or through a virtual meeting?
Dustin, not all deaf individuals prefer to communicate in the same way. Some individuals may prefer to speak, to use sign language, or to write, and their preference may change depending on the interaction. It's best to ask the person what their preference is instead of assuming.
Okay, Julie, what if someone who is deaf or hard of hearing misses something that is said? Should the speaker tell them that it wasn't important?
Dustin, no. The speaker should not decide for the person what is important. All people, including people who are deaf or hard of hearing, want to decide for themselves. When a person misses something said in a conversation, it can be frustrating. Telling the person it isn't important makes it even more frustrating. What the speaker should do is either repeat what was said or find another way to convey the information.
Julie, how about the idea that deaf employees will always need interpreters?
Dustin, this is such a common myth. The fact is, an applicant or employee may need a sign language interpreter for certain situations, like an interview, a meeting, or during presentations. At other times, there are low-tech solutions that can be effective, like writing on a notepad or texting through cell phones. Another helpful tool is to use live captioning.
Thank you, Julie. Communication can be a barrier in the workplace. Can you provide some recommendations for appropriate workplace interactions with colleagues who are deaf or hard of hearing?
Sure, Dustin. To get the person's attention, don't shout. It's best to use a visual signal like waving your hands, or you can gently tap the person's desk or workspace. Make sure to face the person when you are talking with them. If the person is speech reading, try to enunciate clearly, position yourself somewhere with good lighting, and keep your mouth clear of obstructions. If you don't know what the person said, don't pretend you do. Ask them to repeat themselves, and if you are having trouble communicating, use a written note or mobile device to ask the person how to best communicate with them. If someone is using a sign language interpreter, make sure not to block the line of sight to the interpreter, and always talk directly to the person instead of the interpreter.
All right, Julie, let's do another round of myth versus fact with a focus on vision disabilities this time.
Sounds good, Dustin.
Okay, first, what about the myth that people who are blind or have low vision cannot perform work to the same productivity as employees who are able to see?
Dustin, a person who is blind or has low vision can be as productive or more productive than their colleagues who can see. The person may perform the job in an alternative way just as effectively, like with using screen reading software on the computer or tactile markers to identify tools and supplies.
Okay, how about the idea that employees who are blind or have low vision are limited in the job tasks they can perform and the careers they can pursue?
Dustin, people who are blind or have low vision can pursue many of the same jobs and careers as people who are sighted.
Julie, what about the idea that Braille is no longer needed due to the technology available for smart devices and computers?
Dustin, technology has provided a variety of ways to receive and input information. However, Braille is an important way some people access information, and it's just as important as the technological alternatives.
And Julie, let's review a myth common for people who are deafblind. What's the truth behind the idea that they only use touch to communicate?
Dustin, the fact is, individuals who are deaf-blind can access communication in a variety of ways, like all people, such as using the alphabet, sign language, speech reading, and tactile finger spelling.
Thank you, Julie. Can you now share some recommendations for appropriate workplace interactions with colleagues who are blind or have low vision?
Sure, Dustin. First, when you enter a person's workspace or a conference room, identify yourself so the person knows you are there, and remember to let them know when you're leaving the area. It's okay to use phrases like, "See what I mean?" or "Did you watch the game last night?" Don't help without asking, and remember not to pull a person by the arm or cane. And remember, service animals are working, so never pet a service animal, offer a treat, or call its name. You could confuse the animal and put the person at risk.
Julie, as we know, language can evolve over time. Can you share some terms that are no longer preferred and then their preferred alternatives?
Yes, of course. Instead of saying handicapped, it's preferred to say person with a disability. And referring to a feature in the environment. Instead of saying handicapped, say accessible, like accessible parking or accessible entrance. You may at times notice the terms hearing impaired and visually impaired are used, but the preferred way to refer to these conditions are hard of hearing and low vision.
Julie, some people with a sensory disability prefer identity first language rather than person first language. Do you want to explain that a little bit more?
Sure, Dustin. Some individuals with disabilities prefer people first language, while others prefer identity first language. People first language puts the person first and the disability second, like when we say individual who is blind. Identity first language puts the disability first, like when we say deaf individual. So the best practice is to ask the individual how they prefer to be addressed. When in doubt, the recommendation is to use people first language. Because we are aware of these preferences, in our general communications about sensory disabilities, we alternate between people first and identity first language.
Thanks, Julie. I think this is a great place to stop and answer some questions. And just so everyone knows, we did receive some questions submitted with our registration for this webinar, so we'll be weaving those in with questions in the Q&A box, which there are no questions in the Q&A box right now, so feel free to put those in there if you have any questions. But one of the first questions that was submitted ahead of time, Julie, someone said they're concerned about individuals with sensory disabilities fitting into the company culture. They know communication can be a challenge, so what can they do to be sure everyone is comfortable around each other?
Thank you for this question, Dustin. My recommendation is to onboard the new employee as you would any new employee. Being new in the workplace can be awkward or uncomfortable for anybody, whether you have a disability or not. And so my recommendation is to, as you're getting to know the employee, describe their job, their work environment, the types of communications that happen in the workplace, and ask all your new employees, is there anything that we can do to help you onboard and acclimate to this new job that you've just entered into? The person in their response and that conversation that you have may reveal some barriers, and we know whenever we hear a barrier and it's related to a condition that we always want to then engage in the interactive process to explore that more to help find an effective solution. But people with disabilities may choose to, any kind of disability may choose to acclimate to the new environment and figure out how to communicate with coworkers in their own way. So I would just have a general conversation with all new employees, ask how you can help. And then if you hear a barrier, begin that conversation. And some of the things you might start to troubleshoot from there are, what are the best ways that we can get your attention, or what's the best way to communicate in the various types of communications that go on in the workplace. If they mention some best practices in talking with coworkers, you might explore if they would like for you to communicate this information to their coworkers, if they would like to do that. And then be in agreement before any education goes out to coworkers on what the individual is comfortable with.
Great, thank you, Julie. Is there anything special that someone needs to do for someone who uses a service animal?
Yes, Dustin, there are some things to keep in mind. So if an employee requests a service animal be permitted in the workplace as a form of reasonable accommodation, you'll be in the interactive process, you'll be collaborating, and what you'll need to figure out here will be unique to each workplace. But you may want to cover some things like addressing that it is the employee's responsibility to keep the animal in control at all times. The animal is expected to be well behaved. The employee is expected to care for the animal, so whatever the animal might need throughout the workday. It could be helpful to talk about the animal relief areas that are available in your work environment. Some environments that might be obvious, but in others it might need to be established where the animal relief areas are. And then you might want to talk about some procedures for how to handle emergencies that could occur in the workplace. Something else that can be a best practice is to provide some general education and announcement to all your employees that there will be a service, or there will be an animal in the work environment. In that information, it would be helpful to include some contact information. So if you have employees that have questions or concerns, they know who to contact. You might have other employees that have allergies or have fears. And so you'll want to engage with those employees to find out how you can effectively accommodate them, because both of these situations can be occur in the environment at the same time, and there are strategies to help provide what everybody needs. And then just a reminder of some of the etiquette that we talked about. You don't want to pet a service animal, you don't want to praise the animal, you don't want to distract the animal from the reason it's there, and you don't want to ask the person why the animal is present. So we do have a fact sheet on some best practices for service animals in the workplace that's available in our Inclusive Employer Toolkit on the website. I am happy to connect you with that information, and we might be able to include the link for you here as well.
I think Kelly already put it in the Q&A box, so feel free to check that out if you're curious about more information. We do have a question that was submitted now today. So someone asked, when establishing a reasonable accommodation process, is that typically established by human resources, or do you have any suggestions as to how to encourage the human resources department to start advocating for a reasonable accommodation process?
Thank you for that question. And I would say Customarily, that's what I've seen, is that process, if it's established, does come from the Human Resources Department. Maybe that's different if it's a smaller employer, and then it's maybe the responsibility of a certain individual in the workplace. I do want to mention that according to the Americans with Disabilities Act, employers are not required to have a formal process, but it is a best practice. And we do have some information on our Inclusive Employer Toolkit. We have a webinar on establishing a reasonable accommodation process. As far as how you can encourage the Human Resources Department to start advocating for a process, I just think it's a helpful way to organize this, because you want to have a way to receive those requests when they're coming in. You want somebody assigned to be responsible so that it keeps being facilitated through the process, so that a solution can be found and be implemented and monitored to make sure it's effective. So I think it just can be a helpful practice to make sure that this responsibility that employers have is followed effectively. And so that might be one way to start. And certainly we could talk more offline about how to, maybe what some of the best practices are for a process.
Great. Thank you, Julie. I think that's all the questions that we have so far. If you have any questions as we go along, we'll be taking another break before we finish. So feel free to throw any questions in the Q&A box so that they're ready for us when we stop. So back to the webinar. Julie, let's go back to Allison's story. She said all the accommodations she requested were ready for her on her first day of work. Allison is blind and uses a few different reasonable accommodations to perform her job duties. She uses the screen reading software known as JAWS, which verbalizes the information on the computer screen.
And Dustin, JAWS also communicates this information to a Braille display that Allison uses. The Braille display has little pins that pop up or down to form Braille from the information that's displayed on her computer, iPhone, or iPad. She uses this when giving presentations and making audio recordings.
Julie, I thought this part of the story would be pertinent as we discuss reasonable accommodations.
I agree. Just as a review, a reasonable accommodation is a change in the way something is customarily done at work to enable an individual with a disability to compete for a job, perform a job, and enjoy the privileges of employment. We know not every person with a disability needs an accommodation. However, when an accommodation is requested, the employer should begin the interactive process quickly. This is a collaborative process described by the ADA where both parties work together to identify an effective solution.
Julie, obtaining a reasonable accommodation generally begins with a request from the individual.
That's right. An individual with a disability can request a reasonable accommodation at any time by telling the employer they need a change in the hiring process or at work because of their disability or medical condition. The request can also come from another party, like a family member or medical provider. The request can be made in the individual's preferred form of communication, which could be through a phone call, an in-person conversation, or in written form, like an email. And the request can use plain language, which means the individual does not have to reference the Americans with Disabilities Act or use the term reasonable accommodation.
Julie, are there times the employer may ask the individual if they need an accommodation when the individual has not requested one?
There are, Dustin. An employer may ask when the employer knows the employee has a disability and the employer reasonably believes the employee may need a reasonable accommodation at work. So I have two examples to share. First, a deaf employee is required to travel out of state to attend a conference for the first time as a part of his job. The employer knows the employee is deaf and can reasonably believe he may need accommodations to travel and attend the conference. The employer may ask the employee if he needs a reasonable accommodation. The second example is about an employee who is blind who works with a team that is being relocated to an office building in a different location in the same city. The employer knows the employee is blind and can reasonably believe he may need accommodations to orient to the new location. The employer may ask the employee if he needs a reasonable accommodation.
Julie, part of the interactive process includes obtaining documentation when permitted.
Dustin, that's correct. The ADA says employers are permitted to verify a person has a disability. If the disability is apparent, employers don't need documentation to verify this and are not permitted to ask for it. However, when the disability is not apparent, the employer can ask for documentation to verify the disability. The next step employers usually take is to determine the need for the accommodation. The same rule applies here. If the need for the accommodation is apparent, the employer does not need documentation and is not permitted to ask for it. If the need for the accommodation is not apparent, the employer can ask for documentation to verify the need. In the case of sensory disabilities, the disability and the need for the accommodation may not be apparent at times, and when that is the case, the employer is permitted to request documentation if they wish.
Julie, let's discuss how the ADA defines disability because it does differ from other entities and laws.
The ADA defines disability as a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activity. A major life activity is a daily function that is important to most people and that most people in the general population can perform with little or no difficulty. So these are functions like seeing, hearing, speaking, reading, communicating, interacting with others, and walking. Major life activities also include major bodily functions, like the functions of the sensory, neurological, brain, and circulatory systems. How an individual's sensory disability impacts major life activities and major bodily functions will be unique to each person. Now, the ADA does not have a list of conditions that automatically qualify a person as having a disability, but they do provide a non-exhaustive list of conditions that should easily be concluded to be a disability, which includes blindness and deafness.
Julie, once the employer has verified the disability and the need for the accommodation, they can begin to identify reasonable accommodation options. Where should they start?
Dustin, the best place to start is to ask the employee. They may have experienced a similar barrier before and have an idea of what will work best. Another idea is to consult the employee's supervisor about the job's essential functions and any performance concerns. This may lead to an idea for an effective accommodation. And it's helpful to know the barrier the employee is experiencing in the workplace related to the disability.
Julie, what are some barriers a person with a sensory disability may experience at work?
Dustin, a person with a hearing disability may face a barrier with communicating or receiving information one-on-one or in groups and during activities like meetings, phone calls, and training sessions. Or the barrier may be with receiving and responding to sounds in the workplace like alarms, warning signals, and emergency notifications. A person with a disability related to vision may experience barriers with the commute to and from work or work-related travel, navigating the work environment and accessing work-related equipment and materials, performing work tasks like taking notes, completing forms, color coding, assembling and inspecting items, and performing manual tasks. Of course, all employees are unique, and so while a person may experience some limitations or barriers related to a sensory disability, it would be rare to experience all of them. That's one reason why a reasonable accommodation should always be determined on a case-by-case basis.
Julie, it's also helpful to know the many types of accommodations available to consider as the employee is collaborating with the employer is collaborating with the employee to identify a solution.
Yes, accommodations are organized into these types: making the work environment accessible, restructuring a job, permitting a flexible schedule, providing or altering equipment and services, altering supervisory methods, modifying policies, and providing reassignment.
Julie, let's go through some examples of accommodations that fit within each category. Why don't you share examples for people with hearing disabilities, and I'll share examples for people with vision disabilities.
Sure, Dustin. Let's start with equipment and services. Marianne uses a mobile device that she can connect to her hearing aids to effectively communicate over the phone. Some other examples include assistive listening devices that amplify sounds, or an amplified stethoscope for a medical professional. For the workstation, the placement of a mirror can serve to alert a person with a hearing disability that someone is approaching. In some settings, the use of a communication access device that includes 2 units, each with a keyboard and display screen, permits 2 people to type a conversation while facing each other. Another idea is the use of a communication card that has pictures and symbols included that a deaf individual can use as a tool when communicating with others in the workplace. The person could point to a picture or symbol to quickly communicate during urgent situations. Although it's not work-related, we do have an example of this kind of card in the Learner's Guide that can help individuals who are deaf or hard of hearing exchange information with law enforcement. One last example is using tactile and visual signals for emergency notifications or workplace alerts. Some services that can be effective accommodations include on-site or video remote sign language interpretation for interviews and meetings, live captioning by a trained stenographer for presentations and training, and a tactile support provider used during a video relay phone call.
Okay, Julie. Allison mentioned that she uses the JAWS screen reading software in a Braille display to receive and input information through the computer or smart devices. There are many other examples of technology that can be helpful for people with vision disabilities. An employer could provide talking tools and equipment for everything from a telephone base to a tape measure. The employer could also provide a monitor that is flicker-free, an anti-glare guard for the monitor, and computer glasses. There are magnification tools like a portable magnifier that can be used to read labels on products, or computer software that customizes the size of the content displayed on the monitor. And there are overlays to increase color contrast. An example of a service an employer could consider is a person to read printed materials while an individual is completing an application or new hire forms. Another service might be orientation and mobility training for a new employee who is blind to learn to navigate the work environment safely.
Dustin, making the workplace accessible is another form of reasonable accommodation. Related to hearing disabilities, this could include locating the workstation away from busy or loud areas to reduce background noise so the individual can focus on work tasks, or locating the workstation near an emergency alarm that uses a visual indicator. It's important to consider the environment when a sign language interpreter is present. For example, ask the person where they prefer to sit to be able to view the interpreter, where they prefer the interpreter be positioned based on the communication going on, and then make sure the lighting is adequate and the interpreter is not positioned in front of a window.
Julie, one way to make the workplace accessible for people with vision disabilities is to provide alternative lighting, like removing overhead fluorescent lights and add task lighting to the area. A workstation could be rearranged or relocated to avoid natural light that might cause a glare on a monitor or permit lighting to be controlled. An employer could install detectable warning systems in key areas of the common routes traveled in the workplace, as well as adding texture and contrasting colors to stairs. An employer could install a tactile map of the workplace, landmarks, and evacuation routes.
Dustin, I've also known workplaces to assign a partner or a buddy as a part of an evacuation plan. Another type of accommodation is restructuring the job. This means identifying a solution to perform the job's essential functions in another way, or to consider whether the job's marginal functions can be removed or traded with a coworker. For employees with hearing disabilities, this could mean providing brief and routine information in alternative ways, like through written notes, text messages, or an email. Another idea is to include visual images and written information when communicating instructions and work processes. Dustin, what ideas are there to restructure the job related to vision disabilities?
An employer could provide written materials in alternative formats like large print, audio, or in a tactile format such as Braille. Another might be to provide telework, or when meetings take place in off-site locations, allow employees to participate virtually.
Dustin, a common question we receive is whether an employer is required to change a person's supervisor as a form of reasonable accommodation, and the answer is no. However, altering a supervisory method is a form of reasonable accommodation. For a supervisor working with a deaf employee, it may be best to provide information customarily shared in an audio format during meetings through sign language interpretation or live captioning, and follow up the meeting by providing notes of important details or a transcript. It may also be effective to provide various ways of communicating for in-person conversations, like video remote interpretation, speech-to-text apps, text messages, or paper and pencil.
Julie, related to a vision disability, a supervisor might provide information that is typically delivered in a visual format during meetings in an audio format. What are some ways employers can provide a flexible schedule for employees who are hard of hearing or deaf?
Dustin, one idea is to permit an employee to leave work early to attend an appointment that is related to obtaining an assistive listening device or hearing aids, or for adjustments to these items. This time could be made up by shortening a lunch break or working longer on another day.
Julie, permitting a flexible schedule for someone with a vision disability might mean allowing a person who utilizes public transportation to have a flexible start time. It could also mean modifying a break schedule to allow breaks as needed to manage eye fatigue. What about modifying policies as a form of reasonable accommodation?
Dustin, this could include modifying an information technology policy to permit the use of a third-party communication application on a computer or a smart device, so a person can use a speech-to-text app during in-person conversations and meetings.
Julie, you often suggest modifying a no animal policy to permit the use of a service animal. For many people with vision disabilities, this could be an important accommodation. Now, Julie, a lot of these examples are for performing the job. However, sometimes an individual experiences a barrier in the hiring process. What are some accommodations that might be helpful in this situation?
Dustin, the first example I have is a candidate who is hard of hearing and applied for a position as a paralegal. The hiring process included watching a video of a scenario and then answering questions in multiple choice format. The candidate asked the employer if the video is captioned and is told it is not. As a reasonable accommodation, the candidate requested a transcript of the audio content to be provided during the assessment and requested additional time to complete the test. The second example is a candidate who is blind and applied for a position in a call center. During the interview, the candidate was shown a simulation of a customer call in the employer's system and asked how she would respond. This required listening to the customer request and accessing the customer's profile to troubleshoot the inquiry. The employer's system was not compatible with screen reading software, so the candidate requested a reader to read the customer's profile so she can demonstrate to the employer how she would respond to the customer inquiry.
Thank you, Julie. What should employers know about confidentiality in providing reasonable accommodations?
Dustin, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which is the EEOC, has guidance on confidentiality that says the information employers receive related to a disclosure of a disability, a request for an accommodation, and from facilitating the interactive process should be kept in separate medical files that are stored apart from general personnel files, whether they are stored electronically or in physical filing cabinets. The guidance also indicates there are times when certain information may be shared with designated parties. For example, employees who work in IT or facilities are permitted to know what is necessary to facilitate accommodations effectively. And supervisors often need to know about an accommodation so they can help facilitate it or be aware of it, like when a sign language interpreter will be present or a service animal is permitted at work. However, these parties are not permitted to know details about the disability type or its related limitations.
Julie, it's common for supervisors to receive questions from other coworkers about the accommodations they notice in the workplace. How should they respond?
Dustin, a best practice is to prepare a response ahead of time. The response should not disclose that the individual has a disability, and it should not mention the individual is receiving a reasonable accommodation. This term is unique to the ADA and would automatically disclose a person has a disability. What the EEOC suggests is responding in a way that emphasizes the employer has policies to assist any employee who encounters difficulty at work, and then explain these situations are personal and the employer is required to follow confidentiality guidelines. The employer could reassure the coworker that their privacy would be respected similarly. Preparing supervisors and the employees who implement reasonable accommodations with a response for these questions helps them feel comfortable to respond appropriately. One way to prevent these types of questions is to train all employees on all the policies the employer must follow, including the right to reasonable accommodation.
Okay, Julie, I have another story for us. This one is about Casey and was published in the OOD Works newsletter on January 7th, 2022. Casey is deaf. Casey said she is a total communicator, and she said, "This means I use all methods of communication, with my primary method being signing, lip reading, and talking." Casey finished high school in 2018 and began to attend Capital University to pursue a degree in nursing. There, she was the first deaf student in the nursing program. Casey found a student nursing assistant position with the Ohio State University Wexner Medical Center East Hospital.
Dustin, Casey uses a digital stethoscope that connects to her cochlear implants using Bluetooth. When Casey has meetings, she has a device that allows for face-to-face communications by typing messages between coworkers. Casey is set to graduate in spring 2023 and said, "My ultimate goal is to be a deaf nurse practitioner in a deaf populated area so that deaf people will not have any communication barriers."
Julie, since Casey works in a setting where safety is important, I thought we could use her story to jump into our discussion on safety, conduct, and performance. Can you review what employers should know about safety in the workplace?
Dustin, employers are permitted to create a qualification standard that requires all employees not pose a direct threat in the workplace. A direct threat is a significant risk of substantial harm to the health or safety of the individual or others that cannot be eliminated or reduced by reasonable accommodation. If an employer thinks a direct threat may exist, they can't make this determination based on fears, stereotypes, or generalizations. They must use the EEOC criteria to assess the situation, which includes assessing the individual's knowledge, skills, experience, and ability to safely do the job. It includes identifying the specific risk, showing the risk is current and not speculative or remote. It includes performing an assessment based on objective evidence and determining if the risk can be eliminated or reduced through a reasonable accommodation.
Do you have an example of a job where an employer might question whether an employee with a sensory disability poses a direct threat to safety?
Dustin, I have two examples to share. The first is an employee who is deaf, works at a hardware store, and applies for a promotion to a position that includes operating a forklift. The employer is unsure if the candidate can operate a forklift safely and detect dangerous situations indicated by sound. During the assessment of direct threat, the employer and the employee discuss ideas for reasonable accommodations, which include visually highlighting designated routes of travel for forklifts, assigning designated doors for forklifts to enter and exit, establishing rules for all forklift drivers to stop at intersections, installing mirrors at intersections for a visual alert of oncoming traffic or pedestrians, providing visual alerts alongside audio alerts, and positioning a rear vision camera so the operator can view what is behind him. Based on these accommodations, the employer determines the candidate can safely operate a forklift and promotes him to the new position. The second example is a sous chef who is blind. She has 15 years of experience working as a line cook with increasing levels of responsibilities. She applies for a job at a new restaurant, and the employer is concerned the candidate cannot safely work in a busy kitchen. During the assessment of direct threat, the employer considers the candidate's previous experience and her description of how she uses touch to perform tasks other employees use their vision to perform. In addition, the employer and the candidate discuss ideas for reasonable accommodations, which include providing orientation and mobility training to assist the candidate in learning to navigate the environment safely, adding braille labels on oven controls and tactile markers to identify kitchen supplies, and providing access to cut-resistant gloves to use as needed. Based on the overall assessment of direct threat and these accommodations, the employer determines the candidate can safely perform the job and hires her for the position.
Thank you, Julie. What should employers know about conduct?
Dustin, employers can generally expect all employees, including employees with disabilities, to meet their conduct standards. If an employee with a disability violates a conduct rule and disability is not a contributing factor, the employer can apply the same consequences it would apply to any employee who broke the same rule. Now, when an employee responds to discipline for misconduct by disclosing a disability and requests a reasonable accommodation, the employer should begin the interactive process just like any time an employee makes a request. The employer may apply the consequences for the misconduct as long as the conduct rule is job related and consistent with business necessity and equally applied to all employees.
Julie, what is important to remember about performance when it comes to the interactive process and accommodations?
Dustin, there are a few things to keep in mind. First, the ADA does require individuals with disabilities to be qualified to perform the essential functions of the job with or without a reasonable accommodation to receive protection under the law. So employers can expect all employees, including employees with disabilities, to meet their performance standards. When it comes to measuring performance, employers generally assess all employees the same way to determine whether they are meeting these expectations. The most common question we receive is about what to do when an employee discloses a disability during a low performance discussion. The timing of this disclosure may cause the employer to feel caught off guard and unsure of how to handle the situation. Based on that, it could be helpful to train the supervisors or HR staff who are having these discussions on how to proceed when a disability is disclosed. Now, low performance may be the first indicator to an employee that their disability is contributing to their work, which means it can be a natural time that an employee would choose to disclose and may or may not request an accommodation. When the employee does ask for an accommodation, the employer should begin the interactive process quickly, just as they would any request they receive for an accommodation. If the employee discloses a disability but doesn't ask for an accommodation, the employer can ask additional questions to determine if beginning the interactive process is appropriate. Employers also have asked whether they are permitted to apply the consequences of low performance when disability is disclosed, and the answer is generally yes, as long as the consequences are applied to any employee with low performance in the same job class. But remember to also begin the interactive process to consider a reasonable accommodation as well.
Julie, many employers know the benefits of hiring and advancing employees with disabilities, but there are barriers in the workplace and at times reasonable accommodations are needed. What resources do you have for employers to support creating accessible workplaces and providing reasonable accommodations?
Dustin, the first resource I'd like to mention is a lending library. Sometimes an employee and an employer are not sure if a reasonable accommodation will be effective. A lending library offers items and technology that can be borrowed and tested in the environment first. The two libraries we are familiar with are the Assistive Technology of Ohio Lending Library, known as AT Ohio, and the other is from the Ohio Center for Autism and Low Incidence, known as OCALI. The Helen Keller National Center offers a business guide for employers which addresses working with individuals who are deafblind and includes information about communications, reasonable accommodations, and emergency preparedness. OOD offers a searchable database of resources for individuals and employers about deafness, deafblindness, hearing loss, blindness, and low vision. The information on how to locate these and how to search for items is included in the learner's guide for this webinar, along with the other employer resources we shared.
Those are great, Julie. Thank you. Now let's take one more break to see what questions we have. So Julie, Carol asked, who could we contact to help train our employees on JAWS so that we could help the customers entering our facility that would need to use that system?
Hi, Carol, and thank you for that question. My first thought is to reach out to the vendor that you purchased JAWS from, or the manufacturer of JAWS, to see what resources they have available for training. Certainly, you could contact us, and I could see beyond today's webinar if there's additional resources that might offer some training and some best practices for that. But my first thought is to reach out to the vendor to see what they have to offer that might be more specific, since they're very familiar with JAWS.
Thank you. Another pre-submitted question that we have, Julie, what are some accommodations we can provide for employees with hearing or vision disabilities during meetings?
Thank you, Dustin. So some of the accommodations that we've already talked about can be used in this setting as well. And it's important to remember that meetings are occurring in person, but also virtually. Maybe more of that is common now than prior to the past few years. And so Remember, if you're in person and a sign language interpreter is present, to have some good lighting in the environment. Consider where that person is positioned and the background, because proper contrast can help with visually seeing the signing that they're doing. If you're providing audio, remember to use captions for the audio, or to provide a transcript after the meeting. It can be helpful in a meeting to provide the materials in advance so that all individuals are aware of what's going to be covered and addressed in the meeting. Those materials can be helpful to give to a sign language interpreter as well in advance of the meeting, or if you have a trained stenographer who's providing live captioning, those materials can help to inform the services they're providing. Depending on the size and how many people are there, it's always a best practice to use a microphone if you have access to one. I recommend if it's there, just use it. Don't ask the attendees if they can hear you, and if they prefer you use a microphone. There are times that a person may not have disclosed being hard of hearing, and they don't wish to do that in this moment, so they'll say nothing, but then they won't be able to hear you. So it's just a best practice to go ahead and use the microphone. Important not to have interpreters or presenters stand in front of a window because of the glare and how the natural lighting can impact visually seeing the presenter or the interpreter. And then when you're in these meetings, whether they're in person or they're virtual, if you have any visual content that you're sharing, remember to describe that and consider providing materials in large print and with proper color contrast. So those are some quick ideas on accommodations for meetings.
Great. All right, Julie, another question that's come in. Can you please explain what the acronym JAWS means?
Job access with speech, is that right?
Well, I don't know.
JAWS. I believe it's job access with speech. We'll see if I'm right. Thanks for that trivia question.
Well, do you want to just explain what it's used for, maybe, too?
Yes, so JAWS is a screen reading software, and there are a variety of types of screen readers. I'm sorry, I thought you were asking for what the actual JAWS acronym meant.
Well, yeah.
So this is software that will take written material and speak it. So a person who will either auditorily receive that information, maybe through a headset or the speaker in the smart device or the computer, but also through that Braille display that we mentioned. It could take that sound information and turn it into Braille through the Braille display to communicate that information.
Great. Another
job
question.
Access with speech. Thank you. Thank you. Someone's helping me with my trivia today. Thank you.
And great job. You got it right. All right, so one more question that's come in. When crafting communications, can you explain the difference between capital deaf and lowercase deaf?
Yes, so in the beginning of the webinar, we addressed how in the deaf community, there are individuals who see this as a cultural identity and some who see this as a disability. And out of respect for that, we wanted to address that. And so the deaf community uses the capital D for deaf as cultural identity, and the lowercase deaf is the general reference to this community or to this terminology.
Great. All right, that looks like all the questions that have come in today. Thank you for those questions. Julie, before we conclude, I thought I would share some more of Allison's wisdom. She says the most important thing an employer can do when working with an employee who is blind or with any disability is to make sure there is an avenue from the beginning to engage in the interactive process as early as possible. This has helped her to feel supported and valued in the roles she holds within OOD.
Dustin, I agree with Allison. Having that avenue available demonstrates to applicants and employees that the employer cares about what they need to be successful in the workplace. And as we demonstrated in today's webinar, there are many ways to perform the job just as effectively in another way through the variety of reasonable accommodations that are available. I'd like to thank everyone who shared their employment story with us so we could share these examples with our employers.